All right, well, good morning. So, I was about 12 years old, and I was hanging out with my cousin Sam. And where I am from, where I grow up, there's a place called the Big Dirt Hill. And it was called that because it was a big dirt hill. It was a giant hill, a giant man-made hill that was probably around 65, 70 feet tall. And I think it was made from like a housing development and all the dirt that was dug up there, something like that. But it was kind of like this landmark. It was by the lake in my hometown, and all the kids would go and climb on it and slide down it in the snow whenever it would snow and do sledding and all that fun stuff. And it was called the Big Dirt Hill. And it was one of my favorite places to go, and my cousin Sam and I decided to go to the park where the Big Dirt Hill was one year. And we had the brilliant idea to ride our bikes down the Big Dirt Hill. And so we walked our bikes up, and it was a treacherous walk, but we made it. And I will say that my cousin Sam, it was really all his idea. It was not my idea. I was not on board, but I did it because he was older than me, he was cooler than me, and I wanted to be like him. And so we got up to the Big Dirt Hill at the top with our bikes, and because he was the bold one, I was kind of the manipulative one, and I manipulated him to go down the Big Dirt Hill first. I told him that it was his best interest to set the example for me to go down the Big Dirt Hill first on his bike. And I remember this moment vividly. It was like one of those memories that you have that was kind of like your first like big memory that you never forget. And so Sam gets on his bike, and he starts going, and he doesn't pedal. I tell him not to pedal because I'm the smart one. Don't pedal, just kind of ride down. And he starts going, and he picks up speed pretty quickly, but he's in control for the first probably top third of this big dirt hill. And by the middle, he's going really, really fast. And I'm a little worried, but I see the look on his face, and he's like gripping white knuckles. He's determined. He's ready to go. He's going to get down this hill. And by almost the end, and I do say almost, by almost the end, he ends up kind of like getting a little bit cocky because he sees the end in sight, and he can see that he's going to get down this hill. And I remember watching this and thinking, what are you doing, stupid? I'm the smart one. I'm like, what are you doing? So he takes his hands off the handlebars and kind of prematurely celebrates that he got down this big hill. But there's about 10, 15 feet left to it, and I can see, because I'm focused, that there's a crevice right in front of him. And the front tire of his bike slides into that crevice going at least 20 miles an hour. And he immediately stops on the bike, but he himself does not stop and flies face first like Superman slow motion action movie into the dirt, rolling down this big dirt hill. And I'm up at the top going, are you okay? And he goes, And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go check on him. And I step off of my bike, and I walk down with my bike down the big dirt hill to go check on my cousin to see if he's okay. And long story short, I know sometimes I leave you in suspense, so I won't do that this time. He is okay. No broken bones, no super big cuts or anything, just some scrapes and bruises and a hurt dignity. But I learned from his mistake that day. I learned from watching him crash and burn. I learned from him doing something stupid and learned not to do that thing. And so the context and the theme of this morning's message is learning from mistakes. So we're continuing our talk in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And I want to just encourage you that Paul wants us, as well as the Corinthians, to learn from others' mistakes. From others' mistakes. And so I want you to think about, just to get your kind of mind in the right mindset this morning, what are some mistakes that you've seen others make that you've had the luxury to learn from and not make yourselves? Just think about that for a second this morning as we dive into the passage. I know there's a lot for me. I've learned from my own mistakes, unfortunately, but I've also learned from others, like I did my cousin that day. So what are some mistakes that you've been able to avoid because of someone else? So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we're going to read the whole thing, and then we're going to break it down. Verse 1 says this, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses. That's important. We'll come back to that. In the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. That's a tragic verse right there. Verse 6, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. That's an interesting word. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened, he's referring to this again as an example. Now these things happened to them as an example, but that they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the age has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall, like my cousin did. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. This is such a good passage. It's so chock full of stuff. It's basically a history lesson, and honestly, I wish I had enough time to go through all these references back to the Old Testament with you, but some people have told me I talk too long anyways, so I'm just going to make brief synopsises of them. But what happens here is Paul is giving the 1 Corinthians a history lesson. And he's saying, hey, here's some examples to not follow. Here's some things to not do. Here's some things that the Israelites have done that ruined the promises of God for them, and don't follow in their footsteps. And I was talking with a person recently, the few weeks ago at lunch, and he's kind of a new believer, and he was just asking me certain questions about the Bible, and that the Bible wasn't making sense to him, and he had these questions, and they were references to the Old Testament. And I just said, well, how often or how much of the Old Testament have you read? And he said, well, not much, just Proverbs. And I was like, okay, well, that's why it doesn't make sense to you, because the Old Testament isn't important to you. And that's not one of the points that's on your notes today, but I want you to know and remind you this morning, the Old Testament is just as valid and good as the New Testament is. Don't ignore it. Don't neglect it. Paul says, I'm preaching from this Old Testament. I'm telling these 1 Corinthians things that have happened in the past, and it's important to know. And so Paul lays out some examples, and he gives them examples of really good things that God has done, and some really bad things that the Israelites have done. So some of those really good things, he reminds them of these. We're going to break this down, verses 1 through 4. Say, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud. That's a cloud that God's presence was in. There was a cloud of fire and a cloud of God's presence, and he was leading the Israelites in the direction that they should go. And they were to follow this cloud. And all passed through the sea. That's the famous story of the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites leaving and escaping from their captivity and oppression by Pharaoh. And that's the Red Sea being parted in a miraculous way where they could walk on dry land. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And I want to stop right here because some of us might be confused by this, or some of us might overlook this, but I want to make a point here. When Paul says they were baptized into Moses, he's saying that they were submissive to Moses' leadership for a little bit. But at the start of Moses' leadership, they were submissive to him. He was God's man for them. He was the one that God put in charge, reluctantly, but he finally accepted. And Moses was the leader of the Israelites, and they were submissive to his leadership. And I just want to tell you this morning, from a staff standpoint, but from a personal heart standpoint, I am happy to be submissive to Brady's leadership in this church. I want you to hear me say that. I enjoy Brady's teaching on Sunday mornings. I enjoy being in staff meetings with him. He's taught me so much on a personal level, but also from a congregation level. And I am happy and willing to submit to Brady's teaching and his authority. He is God's man for our church. Thank you. He is God's man for our church. He is the leader of this church, and I'm happy to be under his leadership. He goes on to say, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. This is a reference to God's miraculous provision for the Israelites when they were in the wilderness. They didn't have food, they didn't have water, they couldn't survive, and they were talking to God saying, we need these things, and God did not neglect them, God did not forsake them. He gave them miraculous food and manna and bread from heaven and water from the earth. And then finally, he says this, they drank from the same spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. And I'm submissive to the leadership in my life because I know and I trust that the leadership in my life is submissive to Christ himself. And I want you to know that this church is submissive to God. The God of the universe, the triune God, the God who sacrificed his son on the cross and rose again for our salvation is the leader of this church. And I want you to know, as a staff, we are following him. We are following him. We are happy to do what God says. We are happy to go in the direction he leads us. God is our leader. Jesus is our rock. Verse 5 says this, nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. This is such a sad verse. Because God promised the Israelites. He said, I have a promised land for you. I have good things in store for you. I've got this whole world set up that's better for you, that's better than the oppression you came from, but better than your own personal preferences as well. I have this promised land overflowing with milk and honey. And if you just follow me, if you just trust me, if you just do the things that I ask of you, you'll get in and it's going to be amazing. And it says that with most of them, God was not pleased. When it says most of them, it means two. There were about, scholars suggest, there were about 2 million Israelites that were wandering through the wilderness. 2 out of those 2 million made it to the promised land. Isn't that sad? God said, do life with me. Do things this way. I've got something better for you. But for 40 years, they resisted him. For 40 years, they fought back. For 40 years, they did their own sinful, selfish ways. And only 2 of them had the boldness and the courage to stand up and say, no, we're going to go God's way. We're going to listen to what God says. We're going to follow his path. We're going to get to this promised land the way he commands. And we're going to submit to his leadership. And the rest of them didn't listen. And they didn't get in. Now, these things took place as examples for us. These are examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. Why did they not get into the promised land? Because they desired evil. They desired selfishness. They desired sin. And the word here in the original language is the word crave. They craved sin. They craved getting their way. They craved evil things. They craved it. They wanted it. So I got to ask you this morning, what's a craving that you have? Whether super spiritual or silly, like I'm about to give you an example of, but I've got a craving in my life. And I'm going to confess to you this morning that I can be gluttonous. All right, I deal with a craving for fast food. I deal with a craving for fast food, and my wife hates it. My wife hates it. She's like, you got to eat better, babe. You got to eat more vegetables. You got to eat less fat. You got to eat less grease. You're going to have a heart attack when you're 55. You got to do better. But I have this craving for fast food. And this craving comes from 2 places, and I don't know exactly why this is, but I know that it's true in my life. I have this craving whenever I've had a bad day. Whenever things aren't going my way, whenever I've kind of hit some obstacles or I'm behind schedule or life just kind of falls apart, I have this weird craving where I've got to go out and go get a double bacon cheeseburger from Sonic. I got to. It makes me feel better. It tastes so good, and I can just sit and sulk in my own emotions and feel at least a little bit better about myself while chowing down. But then on the flip side of that, Whenever I celebrate, whenever I'm having a really good day, whenever I'm thinking like life's going good and I deserve this and I want to feast. We as Baptists love to feast, and I love that, but especially with fast food, I'm thinking this day is awesome. I'm going to go celebrate. I'm going to get me a number 7 from Taco Bell with steak quesadilla, extra sauce, lots of cheese, some Supreme soft taco with sour cream, and a large Mountain Dew Baja Blast with light ice. I love it. And it makes me feel better. It's a celebration for me. I can say, look at what I've done, and I get to feast and enjoy the fruits of my labor. And I have this craving in my life for fast food. And I got to beat it. I got to get over it. And I'm working on it. I'm trying to eat more salads and vegetables and eat at home. But that's my craving. What's a craving you have? Whether it's silly or spiritual, what's a craving you have? Paul reminds the Corinthians, he says, hey, don't follow these examples. Don't do what the Israelites did. Don't crave evil as they did. And he's telling them that on purpose because the Corinthians were real close. They were real close. They were towing that line of choosing whether to follow God or follow their own way. And so we're going to get into the meat of this now. We're going to get into the 4 examples of Israel not to follow. The 4 examples of Israel not to follow. Verse 7 says, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it was written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. The first temptation that the Israelites were facing and that the Corinthians were in danger of facing was worshiping idols. And like I said, these are all references to Old Testament stories. And I'll just give you a brief synopsis of these. This is a reference in Exodus 32 to the golden calf, where the Israelites were so fed up with God, were so fed up with God's timing. He wasn't doing things their way. He wasn't doing what they wanted. He wasn't doing it in their time. And so they gave up on God and they decided to build their own idol. And it was this big, large golden calf. And they broke the first commandment, the very first one. They couldn't even get to the rest of the 9. After just a few years under Moses' leadership, they said no to God. They said no to Moses. We're going to do things our way. And they worshiped idols. And they put another God before the God of the universe. And the Corinthians were in danger of doing this exact same thing. Just for a brief history lesson, because I enjoy it, but I want you to know that the Bible is real and true. The Corinthians worshiped a lot of deities, but I'm going to give you the top 3. They worshiped Aphrodite. That was the number 1 goddess in Corinth at that time. It was the goddess of fertility and sex. And if you have young children in here, just to let you know, some of this next couple stuff is going to be a little bit, close their ears for just a second. But Aphrodite was the goddess of fertility and sex. And in this moment, they used this goddess as a way to bring explicit sexual immorality into their church. They used a God of possibly good intentions, but it became very selfish and sinful afterwards. And it was not the God that Paul founded this church on. Secondly, their second most used god or goddess was Demeter and Kore. And it was the goddess of nature, basically the earth mother. All right, they worshipped the earth mother, and they would bring their offerings, especially agricultural offerings, to this deity, because that was the way they earned a living, most of them. And they said, we need this deity's help because we're not getting from God what we want, so we're going to turn to another source. And thirdly and lastly, I might butcher this one, but I think it's pronounced Asclepius, something like that. But it was the god of healing. They had the God of healing. And before you make an assumption, it wasn't just a God of physical healing. This was basically the God of solving my problems. God, I've got this problem, fix it. Whatever his name is, I'm probably mispronounce it, but fix it. I'm going to come worship you. I'm going to come praise you. I'm going to bring offerings to you so that you'll fix my problem. Do any of those sound similar to you guys? I want you to know, out of love this morning, we've got our idols. And before you think that an idol is just some Old Testament thing that people created and worshipped, it's also an idol of the heart. And when the Bible talks about idols, it's not just talking about tangible, physical statues that people worshiped, although those were there then and they're here now, by the way. I've seen them in people's homes. Don't think that we're out of that. An idol is anything and everything that you put in your life above God. Anything and everything that you worship, anything and everything that's more valuable to you than the God of the universe, the God who saves your soul, that's an idol. And they worshiped these idols over God. Temptation number 2, they had the temptation to be sexually immoral. And this is a reference to Numbers chapter 25 when they invited the false god of Baal into the Israelite temple. And I got to say this just to be historically accurate and to get the gravity of this situation into your heads. It got so bad within the Israelite camp that they basically were having orgies at the pinnacle altar of this temple. And they invited sexual immorality of all kinds into their midst. And I just want to be honest with you. If you're wondering if it's sexually immoral, it probably is. The Bible is very clear about what sexual immorality is, and I know that a lot of you are gripping your seat tight, all right, but I'm going to go there. Sexual immorality in the Bible is very clear, it's very specific. It is anything and everything that is outside of the covenantal marriage between a man and a wife. Anything and everything that is outside the boundaries and the creation that God set up of a covenantal marriage between man and wife. And before you think that I'm singling something out, before you think that I'm talking about one specific thing, I'm just going to be honest with you. No, it's everything outside of that. It's everything. It's lust. When somebody looks real attractive to you, and even for that split second, and you're thinking, oh, I wonder what it'd be like to be with him, boom, sexually immoral. Any type of pornography, any type, it doesn't matter what, any type of pornography, sexually immoral. Any sexual relation outside of marriage, prematurely, before you get married, or outside of it in adultery, sexual immorality, all of it. They invited these acts into their midst, and it turned God's face away from them. Thirdly, it says, in verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. This is a reference to Numbers chapter 21, where basically the Israelites were like, we have this rule and we're going to do our very best not to break it, but we're going to be as close to breaking it as we can. We're going to get as close to not doing what God says as we can without actually breaking the rule. And they were testing God, and they were pushing his limits, and they were trying his patience. And he was patient with them. And he can be patient with us, but over and over again, they kept saying, I'm going to get as close to this sin. I'm going to get as close to breaking this law as I can. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know this morning that that's the wrong question. The question is not how close can we get to the world. The question is not how close can we be to sin without breaking the rule. The question is how close can we be to Jesus? How close can we be to the God who sacrificed everything for us, who created everything for us, who loves us more than we could ever fathom? How close can we be to him? Not how close we can be to breaking his rules or to living like the world or to following our sinful ways. The question is, how close can we be to God? Don't test him, trust him. God, I'm going to give you my life. God, I'm going to submit to your leadership. God, I'm going to follow your ways because you're more important. You're more lovely. Your way is better. I don't want to test you. I want to trust you. Lastly, number 4 is this: a temptation to complain and grumble and murmur. He says in verse 10, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, when I first read this was kind of like out of nowhere. I was like, wait, what? Like, that doesn't really make sense. All these other things are really severe, right? Like, you were kind of sweating a little bit back there talking about some of those. But, right? But then he comes and says, don't complain. And you're like, wait, I mean, what? That doesn't really fit. That's kind of like out of place. But I'm just going to tell you out of love this morning, church, God hates complaining. God hates complaining, church. Let me just be clear. He doesn't hate complainers, but he hates complaining. And can I just tell you, out of a transparentness in my soul, I was convicted in reading this because a lot of time my prayers are my complaints to God. I say, God, this isn't going my way. God, this isn't going as I thought. God, I need your help. God, I'm mad about how this is going. I'm frustrated about how long this is taking, and I complain. And outside of that, I'm filled, like my life, I see complaining all the time. And I hear complaining a lot, and I just got to tell you, out of love, church, please stop. God is begging this society. God is begging this culture. God is telling this generation, stop complaining. There's no room for it. It's not good. It doesn't help anything. And can I just be honest with you? God hates it. And he's making a reference back to Exodus chapter 10 where they just kept on complaining, kept on grumbling, kept on murmuring, kept on backbiting, kept on talking behind people's back, kept on pushing God's limits, kept on questioning him and not trusting him, kept on literally complaining over and over again for years and years. And God finally said, I've had enough. God hates complaining. But here's where the good news is. If you're ready for the good news, I've got it. Verses 11 and 12 say this. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the age has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. He says, hey, you want to know what the warning sign is? When you think you've got it all figured out. When you think you've got it all under control, when you think you can handle this, when you think you're at the top of the world, when you think that you are the person you're supposed to be and you've reached that mark, when you think that, he says, red flag, alert, alert, you're about to fall. And just like my cousin at the top of that hill going down to the bottom, he celebrated prematurely because he said, I think I got it. I'm almost there. I'm really close to the end and I can let go and I can do my own thing. And he crashes and burns. And just like me, whenever I feel like I deserve this, I need this food, I need this double bacon cheeseburger, I deserve it, I've been good, I've gotten stuff done. Red flag, Jacob, you're being sinful, you're being selfish. You're about to fall. Verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. Check this out. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. And this is where this famous saying comes from that says, God will not give you more than you can handle. A lot of you have probably heard that. That's wrong. It's just wrong. And I don't have the time to explain that fully. But I also want to tell you that I've seen the rebuttal to this. And the rebuttal is God will not give you more than God can handle. And while that's true and that's right, the point is that this is not the context that this is in. A lot of people take those sayings and they say, yeah, this is about my life problems. This is about when things don't go my way. This is about when I'm having a hard time. No, this is about temptation. The context of that verse, the context that that phrase derives from is about temptation, not when things go wrong in our lives. And God promises, get this, he promises, he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. You can say no to sin. You can. It doesn't matter how hard it is. It doesn't matter how deep it is. It doesn't matter how long your struggle has been. You can say no to sin. You can. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. And here's the kicker. I love this. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you might be able to endure it. The way of escape. A lot of people kind of assume that this is talking about some kind of distraction or some kind of solution that God will provide in the moment. And while that very well may be true, that's not the point. Notice that he doesn't say a way of escape. He says the way of escape. And if you're reading the Old Testament, if you're reading this passage in context, he's talking about the way of escape that God has always provided over and over again for the people of Israel, and over again for the Corinthians, and over again for you and me. They had the way of escape. There was one way of escape out of the Red Sea. There was one way of escape into the Promised Land. There's one way of escape for sin and for you and for me, and that's Jesus. You can say no to temptation because Jesus makes a way of escape for you and for me. And so I've got to ask you this morning, what are you saying no to? What are you saying no to? Are you saying no to God? Are you saying no to His timing? Are you saying no to His ways? Are you saying yes to the world? Are you saying yes to its views on sex and gender? Are you saying yes to what the world says? Or are you saying no to sin, no to selfishness, no to the prince and the power of the air, of the darkness, Satan himself? Are you saying no to him and saying yes to Jesus? Paul encourages the Corinthians. He challenges them, and he says, hey, you can say no to sin. You can. It's a promise from God. He's got that promise for you. But to do so, you got to say yes to Him. So my question for you this morning, church, is what are you saying no to, and what are you saying yes to? As the band comes up, I want to close this in prayer. Lord Jesus, I pray for this church right now, God. I pray for anybody's heart in this room who is not fully devoted to you. I pray for anybody in this room who has not given their ultimate yes to you, God. I'm not going to assume that everybody in this room and in this church is a Christian. I know there's somebody out there, God, who needs to say yes to you for the first time in their lives. Remind them of your promises. Remind them of your goodness. Remind them of your way of escape on the cross and on your powerful, miraculous resurrection that saves and rescues us. God, and I want to pray for anybody in this room who needs to say yes to you daily, who needs a reconfirmation in their life of saying yes to you, of saying yes to spending time in your word, of saying yes to depending on you in prayer, of saying yes to following you with their lives. Lord, will you help us this morning say yes to you? Will you help us learn from mistakes of others? Will you help us not make those same mistakes? And will you help us follow you and trust you with everything? It's in your name we pray. Amen. If you want to talk at all, I'll be out in the back under the awning. Love you guys.